Annual WTM question time. Those of you that are observant will have noticed that this year's question time is slightly different. We have one panel member. Many of you will know him. He needs very little introduction. Former Secretary of State, Lord Andrew Adonis, Secretary of State for Transport, and in my opinion, probably the best informed expert, shall we say, to talk about today's subject. But I thought, if I may, I would briefly, forgive me for 1 second, briefly run you through what has been happening in the sense of, we know that the American election has concentrated people's minds, and we've seen more newsprint about the American election of late than anything else, with the exception, I would suggest, of runway capacity in the southeast. Heathrow may get 60,000 more flights. Piece here by Peter Mandelson. Only the wise men can land an airport policy. Another piece. PM adopts brace position as Tories hit turbulence over Heathrow expansion. Third runway, Chris Mullin says, won't satisfy the airport lobby. Wake up. We need a third runway urgently. And so they go on. A third runway, Boris Island, better rail, please just decide. Sunday Express, Thames Airport can be built quickly. And then they say, public get behind Estuary Airport. It goes on and on. Astonishing. I've been collecting these, as you can see, for some time. Risk of economic catastrophe over third runway. Gatwick plans second runway to rival Heathrow. How Luton could be England's airport. Almost there. Airports need an early decision, and as recently as last week we saw, depending which paper you read, if you read The Guardian, the headline was Johnson's hub plans at risk as China buys 5.7% of Heathrow, and in the Standard, Chinese fund snaps up 10% of Heathrow. So it certainly has concentrated the minds of the great and the good. And I'll set the tone, if I may, by reading a short piece from the Sunday Times. The vacillation over airports is indicative of the lack of will. Now Mr. Cameron is turning to the refuge of a weak Prime Minister, an independent commission to get him off the hook. All the while, he has had in front of him a clear strategy that would show vision and decisiveness. A Thames Estuary Airport that would be the symbol of a resurgent Britain. Even his own MPs challenge him as to whether he is a man or a mouse, and presiding over a dignified slide towards insignificance. And finally, in last Saturday's Times, Mr. Cameron's handling of the issue of London Airport does him no credit as a leader. And along with aeroplanes stacked over London, lost competitiveness and long delays, there may be an even heavier toll to be paid for this cynical indecision. It will further poison the public's respect for politicians. Indeed, if not only will, but with a clear plan for airport capacity the Conservative Party proposes, it might still be in office. To implement the Davis recommendations, which will emerge, of course, after the election without a democratic mandate. So it's a bit of a, by general consensus, certainly if you believe what you read in the press, a bit of a mess. So let's introduce Andrew, who those of you that were in Barbados will at the ITT conference will know that Andrew had some very firm views on the way forward. And well, first of all, Andrew, clearly you've been involved in this debate since you were Transport Secretary. I ought to say those of you that have reasonable memories will remember that Andrew was Transport Secretary. He had his own crisis in the sense of he was there during the ash cloud catastrophe, and you may refer to that at some stage. But the Davis inquiry, which appears to be the solution, or appears to be the Prime Minister's solution, You were advocating in Barbados that an inquiry was perhaps the best way out, but it seems that this is not satisfying certainly the press, and certainly I believe it won't satisfy members of our industry, in as much as it's going to take too long and we are just fudging the issue for political reasons.
Well, we're in a hell of a mess in terms of airport policy, and the reason is that unfortunately politics has got in the way of long-term planning. This isn't new. It's been true of the planning of airports in the southeast since the Second World War. I mean, Heathrow, nobody ever foresaw that Heathrow would become anything like as big an airport hub as it's become. It's clearly in the wrong place in terms of the impact that it has on local neighbourhoods compared to other international hub airports. But when it was planned in the 1940s, of course, it then just grew bit by bit. Attempts in the 1950s and 60s to relocate failed. There was then the Roskill Commission in the 1960s to plan the quote-unquote third London airport. They even started building the airport at Maplin Sands. The piles are still there.
Really?
All the legislation was passed. And then there was a change of government in 1974, and the incoming government cancelled the project even after it had been started. Had Maplin Sands been built as the third London airport out in the estuary in the 1970s, I suspect by now it would be the hub airport. And of course the issue about migrating to a place which is has much less impact on local communities would have been resolved. But it didn't happen. Instead we had a 18-year set of planning inquiries and controversy over the building of the fifth terminal at Heathrow, which is of course only recently opened, and now we've got into the argument over the third runway. And if you go back just onto the debate on the third runway, the last government, of which I was a member and then ultimately Transport Secretary, decided in principle that there should be additional capacity at Heathrow in 2003. In the Air Transport White Paper, 2003. But the controversy was so great that it wasn't until 2009 that we decided firmly to go for it. We decided it on the basis that by then Heathrow was at bursting point, 99% capacity. It was impossible to get additional flights in. All of the advice from business and the industry itself was that we would be paying a huge national price in terms of income foregone and business being turned away unless we did expand Heathrow. And then the judgment that I made as Transport Minister and Gordon Brown as Prime Minister was that though the Conservatives had said they weren't in favour of the third runway, once we had taken the decision, it would happen. That one
so
way
just
or
to make it clear, you were in favour of an extra runway at Heathrow?
Well, we published a proposal for a third runway 3 years ago in 2009. The Conservatives at that stage said that they weren't in favour. I thought what would happen is that they would leave themselves some wiggle room. They wouldn't obviously want to talk about airports in the election. There were a lot of marginal seats in West London. Zach Goldsmith, who you all know,
promised to resign, didn't he?
But what I thought would happen is that though there would be a lot of weasel words in the election, the fact that we had at long last had the courage to take the decision in favour would lead the Conservatives, if they came into government, to one way or another to ratify that, and it would proceed. However, two things unfortunately we got wrong on this. The first was nobody expected a coalition. And the problem with the coalition is by now I'm convinced if it weren't for the coalition, the Conservatives would be going ahead with the third runway. The Chancellor has believed in the third runway to start with, has made it very clear he supports it. I think the Prime Minister by now would have found some process, perhaps a review taking a year.
Despite Justin Greening and despite Zach Goldsmith.
Well, Justin Greening, of course, has been replaced.
Yes,
and if I believe what I read in the papers, part of the reason she was replaced was because she has got a West London seat and made it clear that she would in no circumstances agree. And I know she wouldn't agree because when I was Secretary of State for Transport, she was flooding me with freedom of information requests in every aspect of Heathrow. So you clearly weren't going to get a change of policy under her. However, the additional factor that I think has made it impossible for them to move in this Parliament is even though it looks to me as if the Prime Minister and the Chancellor are broadly persuaded now that they can't continue to resist the calls of business, not least because we're, no growth, really serious economic pressure. And the one thing was everyone has agreed on, that to put a big sign outside Heathrow saying closed for business is about the worst possible thing you could do for the British economy. The problem is the coalition. The Lib Dems are virulently against additional airport capacity. It's actually in the coalition agreement, and when you're in coalitions, these agreements take on a special status because they're so difficult to negotiate in the first place, you can't unpick them because you have lots of trading on both sides. And hence, as I said at the ITT conference in Barbados, I thought the only way out of this now, given that it wasn't going to be possible for the coalition to change its its mind in this Parliament was to have an independent review which crucially reports after the next election. This is the reason why Howard Davis has been given 3 years to do this. I mean, never has so long been spent analysing.
So do you think it would have been unrealistic because of the coalition agreement for him to have been told we want a review, we want an answer, a recommendation after 12 months?
In timing terms, of course, 12 months would have been ample.
Yes.
6 months would have been ample. I mean, there's absolute huge amount of work that's been done on the, there've been the options around Heathrow and other airports in London have been analysed to death. Never has one public policy issue been so analysed as the additional airport capacity in the southeast of England has. But because there's no prospect at all of the coalition being able to make a firm commitment before the next election, Howard Davis has specifically been asked to report after the next election. Now, the really difficult thing here now, and this is where your industry is going to be so important, is what the parties say in their manifestos for the next election.
Yes.
Now, if there'll be, I imagine the Lib Dems will commit themselves against the third runway.
Indeed.
And they'll just use straight green arguments. In fact, the green arguments are not straightforward. It's not the case that being pro-environment means that you should be anti the third runway at Heathrow, unless you're going to say no to any additional aviation capacity at all.
So tell us a little, why Ed Miliband changed then your policy and Gordon Brown's policy for the Labour Party?
If Labour had won the last election, we would have proceeded with the third runway. It was actually in our manifesto to proceed with it. But Ed took the view that if the government wasn't proceeding, there was no reason why we needed to remain committed to the policy that we'd had before the last election, and we should be open-minded too on what our policy is. And so therefore we're going in and we'll deal with the review on the same basis as the other parties.
But go back to the manifesto then. What's going to be in the Labour Party manifesto? What do you think? You've already said that you think Cameron and Osborne are in favour. Therefore, in the Tory manifesto, it's presumably going to be yes, another runway at Heathrow.
Well, what I hope will be in the manifestos is a commitment to study properly, without any preconceived policies, the recommendations of the Davis report. That's what I hope will be, because if that's in the manifestos of the two major parties, as I say, I suspect the Liberals will commit themselves against any additional capacity at Heathrow, then if the Davis review recommends additional capacity at Heathrow, neither of the major parties are committed against it, and the very fact that Davis, after one hopes an exhaustive and thoroughly reputable analysis of the evidence, has recommended in favour, and crucially has also done so at the very beginning of the next Parliament, because in all my experience of government, you can take big decisions like this.
Unpopular decisions earlier.
Like tuition fees. Remember tuition fees? Well, that was taken within months of the election, which you couldn't conceivably take in the middle of the Parliament.
The Sunday Times would suggest that that's not democratic, that you're not going to put anything in your manifesto other than we will adopt whatever Mr Davis, Howard Davis actually comes up with, without knowing what that recommendation is going to be.
I think it's perfectly democratic in that everyone will be aware that one of the options on the table is an additional runway at Heathrow. It manifestly is. So unless Labour or the Tories, or both, rule that out, everyone will know it's one of the options under consideration. Now, of course, this is, as I say, coming back to the position of your industry, this is why it's so important, because both my party and the Conservatives will come under huge pressure from those members of Parliament in West London, candidates in West London for seats that they want to win when the other party holds it, and all of the action groups associated with Heathrow will come under huge pressure to rule out Heathrow in the next manifesto. Now, to rule out Heathrow when you've appointed an independent commission would be balmy.
Yes,
I mean,
quite.
absolutely balmy. It completely undercuts the purpose of the independent commission. So seeing that the parties don't rule out any option in advance is going to be crucially important. Now, that is where the business community at large, the CBI, the Institute of Directors, all those business organisations will play a very important role. Because what happened, to go into the politics of this a bit more, part of the reason why David Cameron, to my surprise, came out against the third runway before the last election is the business community split. To be brutal and political about it, what happened was this, that almost every business leader I meet, almost every business leader, there are one or two who are associated with the green industries where this is not true, understands that we need the third runway. They understand that Heathrow's running at 99% capacity. They understand that business is being turned away. They understand that new destinations in China, Latin America and other destinations in East Asia are now going to other European hub airports rather than to London, and we're losing out. They also understand that a hub airport is a very different phenomenon from an ordinary airport. That it's not actually that we're short of airport capacity in London. There was unused capacity in Stansted, Gatwick
Luton,
and Luton.
Yeah.
Luton would love to have an additional one.
indeed.
Luton would bribe, they would themselves pay for the whole thing.
But it
This
couldn't
would
be a
an
hub,
issue.
that's the problem.
But it can't be a hub, this is the point. And it's destinations that want to feed into a hub that we're losing out from, which of course is true of these new destinations in Latin America and China. Now the point about it is that the business community, almost every business leader understood that. However, what happened before the last election is a very large group of business leaders, though they understood the arguments for expanding Heathrow, their main objective was to get David Cameron into number 10 and get the Conservatives in and get my boss, Gordon Brown, and Labour out. Yes. And when Labour committed itself to the third runway, what happened, unfortunately, and I hadn't foreseen this, was that a number of leading business leaders, who frankly should have known better, came out against the third runway. They wrote a famous letter to the Financial Times, signed by, I think it was 15 top CEOs, arguing that we didn't need it, this decision didn't need to be taken now and all of that. Now, why were they doing it? I mean, I don't want to cast aspersions, but the fact is, what was their prime objective? Their prime objective was to get David Cameron into 10 Downing Street, and I suspect actually that issues to do with Heathrow weren't the uppermost issues in their mind when they were dealing with the issue of Heathrow. Now, things have moved on since then. No growth, big problems of business competitiveness, and everyone now understands, including David Cameron and George Osborne themselves, that you cannot go for another 5 years without resolving this issue. And I think that with, if things go as I would expect, the business community, not least, of course, the travel industry and the tourist industry and all those who depend upon good connections for their livelihood, will be near unanimous on the need for additional capacity, and I suspect overwhelmingly in support of additional capacity at Heathrow. And I think that will put big pressure on my party, which is quite right, but also on the Conservatives, not to rule out any option in advance of Howard Davis reporting.
Okay. Now, I will open it up for questions before too long, but and I know we've got a member of the Boris Johnson, the Mayor of London's staff here, taking notes. And tell us a little. I know you covered it when you were out in Barbados. Tell us a little why you think, notwithstanding the inquiry and whatever the inquiry might produce, why you think, or you're sceptical, I think is fair to say, Andrew, why you think that that Boris Island, or whatever you want to call it, will in fact never happen.
Well, let me say that Boris Island is a proposal, or rather the Isle of Grain, and the proposal for an estuary airport, it's not an island now, it's absolutely right that should be considered. And part of the reason for having an independent review is that even if you accept that London needs additional hub capacity, there are two ways it could be provided. One, of course, is by expanding Heathrow. The other is by creating an entirely new hub airport. I said earlier that Maplin Sands was nearly built. It's on the other side of the estuary from the Isle of Grain, but it was under construction in the mid-70s. So clearly, the principle of having an international hub airport in the Thames estuary is not mad. And Foster's, who are a very reputable firm, who of course have done outstanding work in other international contexts in aviation, have put forward a very ambitious plan. Now, part of the reason for appointing Davis, given that the Mayor of London is sitting there in favour of the Isle of Grain as a new international hub airport, is to properly evaluate the arguments. And if Howard Davis were, having evaluated the arguments, to recommend in favour of the estuary, whether it's the Isle of Grain or some other location in the estuary, as the new international hub airport, which I assume would mean closing Heathrow and migrating entirely at some point in the future to there, then I think politicians like me would need to give that very serious consideration. So let me be clear, I am not dismissing it out of hand. I think it's very important that people like me, having urged the setting up of an independent review with a so reputable a figure as the Mayor of London in support of a different option, that we give it a fair wind. Howard Davis has been appointed to look at it, and we see what he gets to.
Well, tell us a bit about some of the practical problems that you think may persuade Davis that it's not realistic.
What are the issues which Davis will have to wrestle with? The cost is huge. The Foster's team themselves say 50 billion. I've been here on these sorts of projects before. When you've got 50 billion as the price tag on the initial project plan, which is basically a slide set at the moment with some supporting work, you can add many billions to that. I would be very surprised if we're not talking about 100 billion plus by the time we get to it.
But isn't infrastructure good at the moment, is it? For growth, it's something that
But of course you're looking at counterfactuals, aren't you? You're talking about a tiny fraction of that to massively increase capacity at Heathrow, which already has all of the, or not all, but most of the surface transport connections that will be needed. Now, that 100 billion involves a second Thames barrage. It involves an entirely new high-speed link to London. That high-speed link, according to Foster's, would take, I think it's 37 minutes to get from the Isle of Grain to
37 minutes?
37. Now, if they're saying that's 37 minutes now, I reckon that by the time you get to it, it could well end up being longer. Now, that's a very, very big factor. Having an international hub airport, which even on their most optimistic projection at the moment is more than half an hour from London, is a big, big problem. International hub airports that really work, and there are examples of those that haven't worked because they've been moved too far out. Hong Kong is always cited. Hong Kong is got very, very fast links. Of course, in the economic geography of Hong Kong is very compact. Heathrow is 15 minutes from central London. Though it has big problems in terms of the noise it creates for the residential communities next to it, in terms of its access to the capital city, it is brilliant. You know, the Heathrow Express straight in now, and of course an additional runway would have that access to, and it's on the M4 straight out to the principal economic corridor of London, the Thames Valley going out of London, and all of that, whereas you're more than half an hour on an optimistic projection at the moment from East London, which is, though fortunately the economic geography of London is starting to move east. There's a lot going on. It's not the heart of London's economic geography at the moment at all. You've got a big problem of bird strike. You've got a massive bird sanctuary on the Isle of Grain. Now, the Foster's people tell me that birds can be persuaded to move, and with a certain investment in sanctuary facilities, you can move them to the other side of the estuary. Well, I take their word for that, but all I can say is the RSPB is the single largest voluntary organisation in the country, bar none. Once they get going on this, are they going to be keen to see this bird sanctuary moved? Will they believe it's possible to move it? What about all these habitats? I mean, I remember when I was Secretary of State for Transport, having to pay some colossal sum to have a nesting site for the stone curlew moved, including providing 100 hectares of land so that they could be moved out of the path of the new dual carriageway A11 that was going to be built. Right. I seem to remember that we had to do special bat tunnels for another road that we were doing because the bats otherwise which were there weren't going to be able to undergo their customary progress. Now, what's going to happen with this very, very large bird sanctuary? That one, once the RSPB get going, will be a big issue. There's the SS Montgomery sitting there with a Second World War wreck with huge amounts of explosive. Well, again, that's not an unproblematic issue moving that. There are existing gas storage facilities on the Isle of Grain, huge issues to do with moving those. Though the residential communities aren't nearly as large as those around Heathrow, there are substantial residential communities in and near the Isle of Grain. And you also have the fact that the air approaches to the Isle of Grain go over Dutch airspace. Yeah. Now again, having been Secretary of State for Transport, renegotiating airspace arrangements is a very difficult and complicated issue. And though if I had to deal with any other international country, I'd probably prefer to deal with the Dutch than anyone because, they generally speaking are very reasonable, pragmatic and civilised. This is nonetheless not an unproblematic issue. Now, if you had any one of those issues to deal with, I would say this is going to be tricky and massively ups the risk factors compared to dealing with Heathrow. The whole of those combined, and I haven't gone through them all either, there are a string of others as well, means this is going to be very, very difficult. And of course, you're dealing with all of these in the context of this being England. Duelling the A11, any modest road scheme undergoes massive public inquiries in this country. As I say, 18 years, and I think it was 3 public inquiries to get the 5th terminal at Heathrow built. The idea that you are in any short space of time going to be able to clear the planning hurdles for an airport on the Isle of Grain costing £100 billion, involving the moving of one of the largest bird sanctuaries in the country, the moving of an explosive wreck, the creation of a second Thames barrage, the creation of an entirely new high-speed line, impacts on large industrial and residential communities around the place, this is going to be a very, very
big
difficult,
very
difficult exercise to
I don't know whether you saw the Evan Davis programme. He's run a couple of programmes about infrastructure and how wonderful the Victorians were about challenging these huge infrastructure issues.
Yeah, but even the Victorians, you can romanticise this in retrospect. The Victorians, of course, built an extraordinary railway infrastructure in the course of about 30 years. They did it by massively bribing every landowner in sight.
Really?
And they couldn't always bribe them. Sometimes they had to go around their land. The West Coast Main Line, you know, the London to Birmingham and North West Railway, which opened just before Queen Victoria's Jubilee in 1838. That railway from London to Manchester has precisely 4 miles that are straight. It's the reason why you need to have these pendolinos with the tilting trains. Almost the entirety of that line, which Stephen knows well because he lives near Chester, so he uses it a lot, is winding, and often very severely winding. But the reason why it doesn't go through Northampton, which used to be one of the biggest conurbations going north, is because the landowners wouldn't have it anywhere near. And the reason why it winds all the way around is to get round landowners' land who wouldn't agree to having it built.
So there wasn't compulsory purchase?
No, you bribed them. Now, of course, the thing is that as they got better in bribing them, and they bribed them with larger amounts of money, they tended to be happier to have it going through their land. Alas, you can't quite deal with infrastructure projects now in the same way as you did with the Victorians. There's this thing called due process. The backhanders and the very large backhanders aren't there in the same way. Parliament, then you had Parliament, which had to agree to these big railway projects. Parliament was stuffed with the very same landowners who are getting all the backhanders for the building of the projects. This was one big Downton Abbey club, if you want to, understand how Parliament and these projects worked in the 19th century. We live in a different world now. We live in a world where, as I know from the planner of High Speed 2, where, my High Speed 2 plan, which was published for the next election, is about to go through a massive judicial review. It has come under huge and ferocious attack by those, both those who it goes near, but also environmental and other groups. And this is despite the fact that in the case of High Speed 2, all 3 of the major political parties are in support of it. When you've got a project where one or more of the political parties are against, and you've also got the environmental movement at large, and those affected locally against, which is the case with Heathrow, and I think would also be the case with the Thames Estuary Airport, then the planning issues are a whole order of magnitude harder to confront.
But presumably you expect High Speed 2 to actually go ahead?
I think High Speed 2 will go ahead, but the reason I think High Speed 2 will go ahead is because you do have a political consensus.
Yes. Okay.
If you didn't have, and I'd be surprised if there aren't more than 100 MPs who don't vote against High Speed 2, because almost any MP whose constituency it goes through is voting against.
We've seen Cheryl Gillam and others.
But I don't know of a member of Parliament on the line of route between London and Birmingham, apart from one or two who's got stations, that aren't going to be voting
but
against
doesn't that make you nervous, because you've already said that in fact it's unlikely the Liberals will ever favour extending Heathrow, and therefore presumably their only option is one of the bizarre options that are mentioned here, or Boris Island.
Well, the Lib Dems, being a thoroughly irresponsible party that never expected to be in government, and I don't think expects to be in government again, being realistic, they will of course have the luxury of being able to oppose the third one without having any positive points. That's the position they'll be in at the next station. They won't have any policy on aviation. Just as they had no policy on tuition fees when they were in government, they then actually were forced to confront the real world. But so in a sense they don't count there. The crucial thing is what happens between Labour and the Conservatives. My judgment, for what it's worth, is that you will only get a policy for building new airport capacity in the southeast of England if both of the major parties sign up to it.
Makes sense.
It's not good enough just for the party that goes into government to do so, because you can't undertake a project like this in less than 2 parliaments anyway. And also you won't get the investors coming in. No serious investor is going to come in and put huge money into Heathrow if you've got the opposition party pledging to reverse it and the work isn't actually underway and substantially complete by the election. So the key thing that we require from Howard Davis and the leaders of the 2 major parties is that they're able to create a consensus between them that is likely to last for 2 parliaments. If that happens, then I think whatever the recommendation, whether it is an estuary airport or Heathrow, will stick. If that doesn't happen, then I think we're in for further nightmares on Airport Street.
Okay. Look, I'm going to open it up to the floor. If anybody has any questions, there are some roving mics, I think, wandering around. Yeah, I can see a few hands. Let's take this gentleman first, and then the gentleman towards the back. Where are the mics? Here we are, coming over now. If you could just tell us who you are, and thank you. Let's take the gentleman in the front first, and then the gentleman at the back.
Good afternoon. I'm Dominic George. I'm a recent aviation graduate from Oxford Brookes University, and I'm also the development manager for Global Connector TMC, which I run. I would like to inquire, although this is probably a bit more of a specific question for people in the knowledge in the industry, as to whether if we were to say we've got to make do and mend with the current infrastructure and hubs that we have available, as to whether mixed mode operations would be a operationally sustainable method of operating within the current climate.
Well, the advice I was given as Secretary of State is that mixed mode is perfectly operationally sustainable. The issue is, of course, the impacts on those who benefit from the current arrangements at Heathrow. It's perfectly sustainable to have mixed mode, and indeed the government has gone halfway towards mixed mode. What it's done is to allow it in periods of acute congestion, and it's done a pilot on that, and it's now proposing to make the pilot permanent. So it's perfectly sustainable. The question is whether there is political will to see it through. My judgment is you could see that through because it doesn't require the planning process required for a third runway. It does require the government to hold its nerve. Boris has come out against mixed mode, and so the politics of this within the Conservative Party aren't entirely easy. And of course the West London community doesn't like mixed mode at all, will be extremely vocal against it. But provided the government holds its nerve, it has the power to grant mixed mode. It's purely a convention that the current operating practices at Heathrow are as they are, and my own judgment for what it's worth is that if mixed mode, if they simply allow it to proceed, after a period of time it will just become the standard operating practice at Heathrow, and because you'll then have the additional capacity that will take advantage of mixed mode, it won't be changed.
Well, before we take the next question, that takes us on nicely to a suggestion in this article, the suggestion of Heathwick, where Gatwick adds a second runway to create a combined hub with Heathrow. Is that realistic?
I think this is absolutely barking, the Heathrow plan. The idea that you could, because it only works if these are an integrated hub operation, so that both Heathrow and Gatwick together then become airside. Now, the problem with that is it already takes the best part of an hour to change between terminals at Heathrow.
Nightmare.
The idea that you come off your plane at Terminal 4 with just think of what the logistics of this mean, because presumably, given it's the bigger terminal set, it'll be 1 to 3 and 5 that have this fast connection to Gatwick. But Terminal 4 is part of it. You then have to flog all the way to the fast connection to Gatwick. You've then got a good 20-25 minutes on your fast connection to Gatwick. You've then got to do all the you'd be into about 2 hours and you've got to persuade all of the immigration and other authorities that despite the fact that you've got this presumably completely sealed capsule train which operates between the two, that they will allow this to be one airport for the purposes of airside arrangements and all of that. And you've got to persuade the airlines that despite the fact that you've got an hour and a half to 2 hour interchange, that is depending upon things working and you're not being held up at one of the numerous different obstacle courses you have to go through to get between the two, that they will treat this as a single airport for the purposes of scheduling and ticketing. I mean, well, let's say I don't know if any other hub that operates on this basis internationally. And though I have a great believer in the British genius, and we did the Olympics fantastically, and we have shown that we can do things that other people are not capable of, the idea that we are able to run a hub airport with two entirely different locations separated by, 40 miles?
40 miles, yes.
And a high-speed link, and what would then be 4 terminal, because you've got 2 at Gatwick, 4 terminal facilities, essentially, but you could call it 5, depending on how you categorise Heathrow. All of them at significant distances from each other within those 2 airports, let alone getting from one to the other. This looks to me to be require a very, very big feat of imagination.
So we'll take that as a no then. Now, I'm going to take this gentleman and then we'll next.
Thank you very much, Lord Adonis. Gareth James from the European Travel and Tourism Advisory Group, but perhaps more relevantly, I'm a resident of Richmond, Borough of Richmond, but I am in favour of the third runway, and of course find myself in a minority of 1 there in Richmond.
But I'll not say too loudly, you may be lynched.
You'll be lynched, yes.
I probably will be. But it's because I've had a long career in tourism that I understand the tourism arguments. But I just wonder if you could elaborate on 2 points for me which crop up in all these conversations I have with my rather angry neighbours. The first is on noise. As I understand it, the third runway would actually not increase the noise for people living under the current flight path, but just upset a few more people who are living further north of where we are in Acton and Ealing and so on. And the second point I'd like to ask you is, so I got it clear in my own mind, if you could ban airlines from Heathrow that weren't absolutely required to have a hub, in other words, some of the charter flights or some of the low frills airlines and so on from Heathrow, would that not help the capacity problems of Heathrow?
Clearly it would make an impact, yes, but it would be another...
What would be the kind of percentage then? Of
I'm not sure. I don't know what the people who know what the charter percentage is. I can't remember. But
yeah.
Sorry?
It's quite small, I think.
Somebody's saying 3%. My memory is it is very small. Yeah. Just as the proportion, the argument on high speed, which is equally irrelevant in terms of a medium-term planning, is a short-term fix, which is the high speed will somehow create masses of capacity at Heathrow. Well, less than 10% of Heathrow's traffic is domestic, and from memory, I think half of that is London to Glasgow, Edinburgh, which is the only substantial domestic market which you could see transfer anyway. So whilst it's true that both of those, both high-speed rail and removing charter flights, could make a modest difference to capacity, it would be small. It wouldn't be anywhere near as great, for example, even as mixed mode would make. On the first, the numbers affected by noise would go up, but the crucial thing in terms of, and the noise is a very important issue. My understanding of the politics of Heathrow was transformed when my official showed me a slide which ranked European hub airports by numbers of residents who are affected by above 57 decibel noise, which is the definition of serious noise. And from memory, I think a third of the total are around Heathrow. And Heathrow, from memory, has nearly twice as many as the next airport. That summarises for you the acute problem. It's not that our politicians are unusually lily-livered in England compared to other countries, which is the line I used to I didn't put it quite like that because I don't like to be quite so blunt. But that was the sort of view I had when I went to Frankfurt, which has just opened its fourth runway, and saw that they'd done it. My sort of view was that, well, if the Germans could do it, have a much stronger environmental movement than we've got, surely we can. But actually the numbers affected by serious noise around Frankfurt is minuscule compared to the numbers affected around Heathrow. And it's also true that the number has been declining as airport practices have improved, the way that holding patterns are handled around Heathrow has improved, and of course aircraft have got significantly quieter with each generation. The numbers affected by 57 decibel noise and the noise contour has steadily contracted, and it's hugely reduced from the position 30 years ago. And even with the third runway, it would still be only a fraction as large as it was a generation ago. The problem is that, having said all of that, what would your neighbours in Richmond prefer? Obviously they prefer to have fewer flights rather than more flights. In fact, they're actually conflicted. Most of them use the airport, I imagine, use it frequently, and indeed a good proportion of them, part of the reason why they live in West London is because of proximity to the airport. But of course, we're all capable of wanting to have our cake and eat it. And it's perfectly consistent both to live in Richmond because you actually want to be close to Heathrow, but only want the flights that you take to be the ones that take off, and not the flights that everybody else takes to be the ones that have to use the airport. So all of these things are true, that it is true that the third runway, just in terms of the impact on noise in the existing corridors, isn't great. It is true that aircraft have got significantly quieter, but allowing for all of those factors, what the position that people in West London take is in a sense perfectly rational, which is that they would prefer to have fewer flights rather than more flights. And of course they'll campaign against any expansion of the airport.
Okay, gentleman in the blue shirt.
James Avery, founder of flightmapping.com. When I set up this website early on around 2003, you had this white paper that you mentioned, the Future of Aviation white paper. And you said that looked at Heathrow and suggested a third runway at Heathrow. It also consulted everyone in the London area and across the rest of the country. And it very categorically dismissed the airport at Cliff. But equally, it dismissed the airport at Rugby. So the first question I'd ask you is this whole Howard Davies review kicking it into touch so much that actually they're going to come back to Rugby? That's not a serious question. The point I would say is Heathrow, by all accounts, you're saying once they can get through the politics after the next election, no coalition, no Lib Dems. If it's likely to happen, is the answer not mitigation, mitigation, mitigation?
Absolutely.
You have, there was a figure that came out around 100 deaths, 50 to 100 air pollution deaths attributed to Heathrow out of 4,000 for the rest of the country. So that's 3,900 or so from other causes, largely road related. So why not saying, well, we won't bother the Dutch with their airspace. We'll let Heathrow have as many parallel runways that Schiphol has, and we'll also copy what they do in Amsterdam, where 40 to 60% of journeys are made by bike. And that will cost around that'll cost around £1 billion. And if BAA want this runway, then we get them to go Dutch on the cost, they chip in half the cost.
Well, all of those are things that I think Howard Davies should consider. The Air Transport White Paper was, of course, 2003. The consultation was after. Given that we have now essentially lost a whole parliament in terms of decision-making, 5 years, I think it's perfectly reasonable to look at the evidence again. There's also a very substantially new proposal that's been put on the table since, which is the Isle of Grain proposal. That needs to be properly evaluated. It would need to be evaluated anyway, but the fact that you've got the Mayor of London supporting it, I think means it's absolutely essential if you're going to generate consensus for any decision, that the specific Foster's proposal that the Mayor of London has endorsed, that specific proposal is properly evaluated. Now, that specific proposal wasn't on the table before 2009, so it wasn't evaluated in the way that it needs to be now. And a good part of the purpose of Howard Davies is that having evaluated those options, on Gatwick, of course, because of the covenant, it wasn't possible to build a runway before 2019. So that's a new factor too. Given that we've delayed so much, it would now be possible to build that second runway at Gatwick, which wasn't possible when I was looking at options before 2009. Given that you've got all of those new factors in play, and crucially, as I say, that this will only proceed if we can generate a sufficient political consensus, the Howard Davies review is the only show in town. There's no way that we're going to reach a decision by any other process than an independent review which carries significant credibility and has and is seen to have evaluated thoroughly all the options, including, crucially, the estuary option, which of course it's possible that Howard Davies might come out in favour of, because if you've got the Mayor of London sitting there saying that that is the one that he wants and is campaigning for, then, and he is of course a massive player in this, not just Boris, but any likely successor as the Mayor of London is going to be a crucial player in this. You have got to find some way of bringing the Mayor, the two major parties, into common agreement on this, and Howard Davies is the only way I think it can be done.
Before we run out of time, let's touch a little bit on another option that's been mentioned, and that is the development of regional airports, Andrew. You know, I noticed, and many of you will know him, that Jeff Muirhead, former chief executive of Manchester Airport, is in fact on Howard Davies's panel or committee, and Jeff is a huge supporter of regional airports. And in fact, one of the options here in the Times is greater use of Birmingham Airport, particularly now HS2 is going to be online. What do you think about the practicalities, and will that be part of Davies's remit?
Well, Davies should certainly look at the regional options, particularly those that could make a significant contribution to the southeast. Now, part of Birmingham's pitch is that once HS2 is built, and from Birmingham International to Old Oak Common, which is the junction with Crossrail just west of Paddington, 10 minutes away from Heathrow, that is 31 minutes.
Wow,
31 minutes.
Yeah.
So actually, it's not that different from your Heathwig.
No.
Now, the plus is that telescopes the distance between Birmingham Airport and Heathrow. It telescopes it. The minus is, it is still 31 minutes. And so if you're talking about this being an integrated hub, you've got exactly the same arguments.
But quicker than an estuary airport, in effect.
Oh, much quicker,
yes.
In terms of access to Crossrail and central London. Much quicker than, when I say much quicker,
yes.
than the estuary airport. But you're still left, though, and this is the crucial issue, you're still left, unless you can somehow pull off the trick of this being an integrated hub, and I don't think that's any the arguments there are any different in respect of Birmingham than they are in respect of Gatwick, you're left with the argument that Birmingham should be the second hub.
Yes.
Rather than Gatwick. Now, it may be that it should be the second hub, but the high-speed line isn't, with the best will in the world, going to be constructed to Birmingham until 2026. And that was my planning horizon, and as those of you who know me will know, I'm a professional optimist. For 2026, it may be we're into the 2030s. So if you're dependent upon the high-speed link to make Birmingham viable as the second hub, and that doesn't appear till the 2030s, then that isn't very clever if you start building the runway. And
I'm not going to be getting much use out of it. No, that's true.
For another 10 years.
Okay, there's a gentleman there in a white shirt. Where are the microphones? There we are. And then I've got one over here, one here, and one at the back. Okay.
That was a very interesting topic, I think, on the estuary. But I'm just wondering, Mr. Johnson is the Mayor of London. When did he become an expert on aviation?
Well, to be fair, when did any politicians become an expert on aviation? Or indeed, have you ever met a politician who's an expert on anything?
Yes, you.
Except possibly their own expenses, and look what happens there. But they are the job in a they are the people whose job it is in a democracy to broker expert advice and then to make political judgments.
But I've been involved in aviation. I spent 25 years at Heathrow, and I spent 8 with Aer Lingus, and I spent 18 at Stansted mainly with Ryanair. I don't know how they're going to move Heathrow. I don't know how they're going to move the infrastructure when there must be about 10,000 hotel rooms. And also, if you sat down and spoke to the 15 or maybe 10 or 15 top chief executives of the airlines and asked them would they like their operation to be on the estuary, I know what they'd say. They don't want to live out in the estuary. They want to live in Knightsbridge and Chelsea and places like that. And in my view, it's all this procrastination. We're going to wait 3 years, and I bet you it won't even happen then, because there'll be still some other barriers put up. And you mentioned Frankfurt. Munich Airport is 15 years old. Now they're opening a second runway, and I think the same is happening in Amsterdam. And even Beijing Airport, even though it's a new airport, they're opening up a new airport 30 miles south with 8 runways. Now I know we don't have that kind of land, but is it a question that nothing has happened?
The question?
Do I agree?
Do you have a question?
The question is,
does he agree?
Is Heathrow or else? There's no other show in town.
It's Heathrow or else, okay.
Well,
okay.
How can I put it? You may say that I couldn't possibly comment.
Gentleman at the back. With it. And then there's one.
Thank you. Hi, I also live in Richmond and I'm in favour of the third runway, so your previous questioner is not alone.
An exclusive club.
Is there a third?
An exclusive. One of the options that I read about recently was to build 3 new runways at Heathrow, but going westward, which would retain all the infrastructure, but reduce the noise in West London, and I wondered if that was one of the options that was being considered.
Well, I imagine that Howard Davis will look at that option. That wasn't an option which we seriously considered before 2009, and the advice I had on it is that there are a whole set of technical and other obstacles to it. But that proposal has been put there. It's the product of a man called Tim Loynick, who's an extremely creative economist who likes problem solving. He's now a government advisor, as it happens. That was his last act before he did that paper for a think tank, and I imagine it will be considered by Howard Davis. But that is a very, very ambitious project. It's for a 4 runway airport that would involve, as you say, moving 3 of the runways westwards. It means filling in a reservoir. It means it means tunnelling a large part of the M4 under the runways and part of the airport. And though he argues that it has less noise impact because of the movement west, it also moves it towards Windsor. Do I need to say anything more?
Right. Another question here in the third row back. Where are the ladies gone with the microphones? All right. We'll take Rob first. Yep.
Okay, thanks, Stephen. One question about the bigger picture, and just whether analysis has been done on what is the actual cost, both economically and in terms of UK as a commercial business hub, for every year that this decision and a resolution gets made.
Well, I hope Howard Davis will publish that information at an early date, because that's very important for focusing people's minds. It's clear to me that a price is being paid, because I talk to airlines that would be putting new services, particularly for new destinations in China and Latin America. They would be putting those services into Heathrow, but they're not, and they're putting them into other hub airports because of the failure to expand Heathrow. But it's largely, at the moment, anecdotal. We did an analysis before 2009, but that's now 3.5 years out of date. And it's developments since then that are important. And Howard Davis will, of course, have a group of economists there, and they need to start publishing that information soon. To get it into a bit more detail about how I think Howard Davis should undertake his work, I think he needs to separate out the issue of hub capacity from pure capacity. If what's needed is just an addition to capacity, airport capacity in South East England, this is a lot more straightforward. Indeed, it's arguable you don't need any additional capacity in South East England. It's arguable. If you look at unused capacity at existing airports, if you take a view on what could happen at Luton and so on.
And Stansted, yeah.
Yeah, and Stansted. And I mean, it's arguable, but though probably you would need an additional runway somewhere, but it's arguable. However, if you need additional hub capacity, then of course that can only come at one of two places, or one of three places conceivably, either Heathrow or an entirely new hub airport, or you do actually persuade me that I'm completely wrong, and you can have a two-location hub airport. But to make the case for hub capacity, what Howard Davis needs to do at an early date is, as you say, to publish reliable statistics on flights and destinations which are economically important to the UK that would have been served if there was additional capacity at Heathrow, that haven't been served, and to be able to make a plausible assumption that it was the absence of hub capacity at Heathrow that led to those flights going to other countries. That's the key.
Thank you.
That's the key issue.
We've got time, I think, for one more question, if it's a quick one.
Thank you. Yes, it is a quick one. You've referred to the planning delay, particularly in the case of the Estuary Airport. Given where we are and given the vagaries of the sort of planning system in England, what is the most optimistic for a third runway being developed at Heathrow if that was the option? And would the loss be able to be made up, or part of the loss be able to be made up once the capacity increased?
Well, it's going to be a few years, the planning process, once the government takes a decision. How many years depends upon how the government itself handles, I mean, how quickly it moves to publish the proposal and start the planning process, and how and what other factors are in play. So the present government abolished the Infrastructure Planning Commission that would have taken decisions of this kind. With there was the policy we had in place, which was national planning statements, which the aviation one was the first one, which will guide the Infrastructure Planning Commission, which was intended to expedite the planning process. The present government has disbanded, I think very foolishly, not just for transport policy, but also for energy policy. They've disbanded the Infrastructure Planning Commission and the national policy statements. They'll end up reinventing them. Indeed, they already are essentially reinventing them in a different guise. So a lot depends upon what the planning arrangements are that are in place. The arrangement I think would be best, but I was advised it couldn't be used for airports, would be the hybrid build, which is the way we build new railway lines. The Channel Tunnel rail link and the Crossrail line, which is being built in London at the moment, were both done by hybrid build. The beauty of the hybrid build process is, though it's a very exhaustive parliamentary process and does take several years to get through, Parliament is of course sovereign. And once Parliament has decided, which is what it did in respect to the Channel Tunnel rail link and Crossrail, that this is going to go ahead, having listened to all the objectors and made whatever changes are necessary to meet what it regards as their legitimate concerns, it then does carry through. The problem with the non-parliamentary planning process, as we found with the fifth terminal at Heathrow, is that even after you've gone through whatever is the planning regime in play at the time, you are still subject to endless judicial reviews and other legal actions to seek to stop the project proceeding. So if it was possible to carry through, and this is actually something that Howard Davis I think should look at himself, if it was possible to implement any new either a completely new airport, if it's in the estuary, or additional capacity at Heathrow, or whatever other option he may recommend, if it was possible to implement that by means of hybrid bill, which is straightforward legislation, which is enacted by Parliament that gives all of the planning powers that are necessary for the project to be completed, then I think that would be the best way forward, and that could significantly shorten the planning process.
Thank you, Lord Adonis. Ladies and gentlemen, we've run out of time. I hope you found it interesting and rewarding and informative. It seems to me that whatever happens, that the Davis Review certainly has a big burden of responsibility, because it seems that both major political parties are almost honor bound, in a sense, to accept the recommendation, because if they don't, where do we go from there?
They're very good, though, these politicians, they're very, very good at finding the long grass. So don't rule out the fact that all kinds of warm words are uttered at the time when Howard Davis reports, but once the opponents get going, the long grass is found, and it would not amaze me if in 10 years' time, sitting here in the Excel Centre, we're debating who knows, the Freudman Review into additional airport capacity needed in London and the southeast of England.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a very warm thank you to Lord Adonis. Thank you, Andrew.